and welcome to the Art of Being Human. Now we're going to go again and go back to the situation of death and bereavement and grief and bereavement and how they're all connected. And what I have done already is I've talked to you about the stages of bereavement and the stages that you go through when you're diagnosed with something that's terminal and stages that you go through when you've lost somebody because they have died. And you know, the stages are pretty much the same. One thing I didn't get into much was the bargaining stage, which occurs if you've been diagnosed with something and you're desperate to stay alive and you can't stand the thoughts of the fact that you're going to pass on. And of course, that's a very common reaction. A lot of people will go into a bargaining stage and they bargain with God and they'll say, if you heal me, I will do this, that, or the other. I'll be a better person. I'll do more work for you. I'll attend church regularly. Whatever their promises are, they make a bargain with God, or they try to make a bargain with God that if God will heal them and they don't pass on, then they will do whatever their end of the bargain is, whatever they say. Now, I've known people to do this, and sometimes, for some reason, and it may be God, I would assume it's God, they do get healed. They get better. And so they do have more time. And some people are very honest and they don't backtrack. They fulfill their obligation that they promised to God. I knew one girl, she had a beautiful singing voice, but she wouldn't sing very much. She just didn't want to bother. And then lo and behold, she was struck with throat cancer. I don't know why. I don't know whether she was a smoker or what. I don't know what the circumstances were. But I know that she had throat cancer. And she made a bargain with God that she would sing for him if she was healed. Well, lo and behold, she was healed. And she did sing for him. And she had a wonderful, wonderful voice. So it's that kind of idea that if you bargain, then you can get what you want, but there's a promise that you make and you need to fulfill it. Some people don't fulfill it. I know I read about a woman who had arthritis very, very badly, and she was not able to walk. And she was very, very angry at her husband about something. And she went to some kind of a Christian worship service where the preacher talked about forgiveness and how it was necessary to forgive. And she did that. And lo and behold, she didn't have any more arthritic symptoms. She became well. She was able to walk. But that didn't last too long because she started getting bitter again. She was bitter at him for something. I don't even know what it was, and it's not important to know. The fact is she would not be willing to give up her bitterness and not be forgiven. And so after that, she ended up in the wheelchair again with the same symptoms as she had before. I've always said, and I do believe this is true, that forgiveness is very important in the healing process. For some reason, if we can let go of what somebody has done to us, it helps us in our grieving, it helps us in our healing process. It is definitely true. And so she would not be willing to continue without her bitterness. She wanted to hang on to her bitterness against her husband. I don't know what he did, and it's not really important to find out what he did, because it's the principle of the thing that counts, that if you are forgiving, it is easier for you to heal and easier for you to get through grief than if you don't be forgiving. Now, it is part of the nature of the human being that we sometimes becomes angry at the person who died. Not that they would have chosen that path, they probably wouldn't have, but one of our grief reactions is to be angry at the person who died. But I don't consider that anything more than any of the other symptoms that you have when a person has passed on, because it is one of the symptoms of grief. And then as you go through the grief, that subsides along with all of the other symptoms that you have. So I want to go over first here the physical symptoms of grief. You can have both physical and emotional symptoms of grief, and I just kind of want to list them off, because if you are a person that is a normal person and you have normal relationships, a lot of the symptoms that you get when you are going through grief might be frightening. But you can consider, unless you're going to hurt yourself or somebody else, that these symptoms won't last too long and they're a part of the grieving process, and that they will pass off with time as you go through the grief process. But here are the symptoms. Physical symptoms of grief: tightness, a lump in your throat. A lot of times people who want to cry won't or don't want to, and they get this lump in their throat. But a lump in the throat is not an uncommon symptom of a person who's going through grief. Difficulty breathing, feeling that you're choking, that you can't get your breath and you're choking. Frequent sighing, weakness, tiredness and fatigue, chills, tremors, being very tense, slow to do physical chores. And that's true. I remember when I first found out that my father had passed, I was living 4 hours away. I was teaching. And I lived 4 hours away from where my mother was, where I normally would go when I wasn't there. And it took me a whole day just to get things together, like toothbrush and toothpaste and a change of clothes. I'd sit and kind of stare in space, and just kind of reflect. And then I'd do something and get something together. Then I'd sit there and kind of reflect and stare out into space. And that's a very normal kind of grief reaction. And my father's funeral was the first funeral I had ever gone to. And his death was the first close death I had ever experienced. And I was young, but I wasn't a child by any means, but I was young. And this kind of reaction is pretty common among people who have discovered that they've just lost somebody. So you're slow in physical chores, your stomach feels hollow and empty, food is tasteless, you don't want to eat. These symptoms will pass. It's not unusual that you will be oversensitive to noise, and it's not unusual if you have eating problems and sleeping problems and depression. It all goes along as a total package, and I'm not saying you're going to have all of these symptoms, but if you have a few of them, or even if you have many of them, that's just typical of an initial stage grief reaction. And as time goes by, these symptoms usually abate. Now, if they don't abate and you have problems with them, you really need to get help with that. There's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't get help with symptoms if you find that they're difficult, if you can't kind of move through them. You don't have to be a hero and suffer everything. If you can get help and if you need help, then by all means get it. Now, here are the mental symptoms, some of the emotional symptoms that you might have in an early stage grief reaction. You may feel like you're losing your mind. You may feel numb. You may feel like you're in a state of shock. There's a sense of unreality. It's difficult to explain what this is like, but it's like you're in a movie set and nothing is quite real. You're there, you're functioning, but it's not quite real. It's like you're playing a part in a film or something like that. There's nightmares, feelings of being abandoned, and that's not unusual at all in a grief reaction. You have anxiety, depression. You have feelings of despair, ambivalent feelings. You can be okay one minute, not okay the next minute, and you kind of filter back and forth. There are times when you feel relief that the death has occurred, and then you feel guilty because you feel relief. So don't feel guilty about it, because that's also a part of the reaction to bereavement. Now, if you feel like it's good that this happened, you may be reflecting on the fact that the individual now does not have any more pain. They're gone, and so therefore the suffering on earth has been finished, and so therefore you're relieved by that. You're relieved that they don't have the suffering or the loneliness or whatever symptoms they may have been experiencing. You're glad that it's an end point for them. So that's perfect perfectly normal. You feel ambivalent, you feel hostile, you have an inability to function, you just can't really do anything. You're sitting there and it's hard for you to function. And this is where it's good for your friends to come by with food, not that you want to eat, but that you should eat. You have to maintain yourself. But to go through cooking meals and something like that, you don't want to do that. That's too much activity. There's sadness, anger, guilt, loneliness, a feeling of helplessness. There's a yearning to have the person back. Sometimes a very intense yearning to have the person back that passed on. That's called an episodic pang. And you get it every so often. There's all of a sudden it overwhelms you. You know, you're doing fine, you think you're doing fine, and then you have this intense desire for a person to come back, even though they can't come back. And so that's an episodic pang. That's difficult to deal with, it's painful emotionally to deal with, but then that will phase off too, like all of the other symptoms. And the relief, you may feel relief that the person has died. Now, depersonalization, I need to explain that. It's a feeling that nothing's quite real. You know, like I mentioned before, about the feeling that nothing was real, or you were like on a movie set or something like that, and there was a derealization going on. Well, depersonalization is very similar to it. You feel that things are not real. You're playing a part. You may have confusion. You may have preoccupation, a preoccupation with the deceased, where all you want to do is think about that person and deal with that person. And I know my mother, when my father died, she wanted to kind of have a memorial set up right in our own house, you know, to honor my father. Well, that fortunately didn't happen, but she started to do that. There was one area of the house, nothing but pictures of my father. That would not be healthy if that continued. But that is a part of what people go through when they first have that separation and loss. What they want to do is they want to make a memorial to the person who has gone, if it's death. Now remember, you can have a lot of these reactions if you have grief from another cause besides death. Any kind of a loss can cause grief, but probably not to this intensity that I'm describing now. If you have a friend that moves away, you can get some of these grief reactions because you're not going to be seeing them very often, and maybe not again. But you know, one of the things I like about the internet is the fact that you can Facebook people and you can use Skype, and you can be in touch with them even though they're far away. And this is the way, and also Facebook and things like that, you can keep in touch with what your relatives are. I have a niece now that's in Washington State because she married a serviceman, and they moved to Washington State where he's been stationed. And so we keep in touch through Facebook, through pictures, through the internet, writing to each other on emails and stuff like that. So there is a way, and this is the good part of what the internet can do. It can keep you in touch with those who are gone, as long as it's not a death situation. That can be helpful. And of course, also with grief, you have something called the sense of presence. The sense of presence means that you sense the presence of your loved one even though you know that they are gone. It gets to be very intense. Some people actually think that their loved ones are still there. They can't see them, but maybe they can. When I say maybe they can, maybe they think they can. One of my friends who was living with us for a while, she lost a relative that she was very close to. And she went down cellar one day to do a laundry, and she thought she saw him sitting there. And she saw him sitting in a chair. You could see his whole form, you could see his whole face, you could see his whole expression, and she became frightened and ran upstairs and didn't do her laundry that day. Now, did she see him or did she not see him? I think it could be a psychological reaction because of the intensity of her grief, but I can't really say she didn't see him because I don't know whether she actually did see him or whether it was a figment of her imagination. I don't know how to balance that off so we could get a realistic view of what she saw or what she didn't see. I remember when my brother died, I went to a restaurant with my mother, a family restaurant, and sitting kind of a kitty corner from us was a man who looked exactly like my brother, and I do mean exactly. He was like a clone. He was closer than a clone. Everything about him was exactly like my brother. The way he talked, I was sitting close enough to hear him talk. He had somebody with him. The way he brushed his hair back, the way he took his glasses on and off, it was just exactly like my brother would have done. He looked exactly 100% like my brother. And I wanted to go over and say, you know, who are you? Are you my brother? You know, but he didn't say anything and I didn't say anything to him. But it really was an unsettling experience to see somebody that was so close in physical appearance and in his voice and in his mannerisms. It just was unsettling to see the person who we had just buried sitting there in the restaurant practically across from us talking with another person. So did I see him, or did I see somebody that just had an unusual appearance, like exactly like my brother? I haven't seen him since. So how do you judge something like that? When people say they see their loved ones, how do you judge? You know, maybe at some point they can visualize them, or maybe they did see them, or maybe they didn't see them, and it's a process of the grief reaction. I don't know enough to be able to answer that question. I know it's an experience that people have, and it's a legitimate experience. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, it's legitimate for you because you're the one who have experienced it. But I can't have a good rational explanation for things like that because I don't think anybody knows. It's just some things that happen. So I'm preparing you for anything that can happen. Not that it will, but anything that can happen when you're having a grief reaction. A lot of times people have a social withdrawal. They don't want to do anything. They don't want to see anybody. They don't want to hear anything. They want to just be left alone in their grief. And I think a certain amount of aloneness is important. You have to reflect. You have to think. Now, of course, I do a number of funerals. I'm retired, but I still do funerals. And I know that I've changed the way I do them somewhat. What I do is part of the funeral's not very long. My funerals aren't very long. I don't think you gain anything by making anything long. I think you only drag out the suffering. So I keep them short but very relevant. And one of the things I do in a funeral is I start talking a little bit about healing from the grief, because a good funeral, if you have a good funeral, and there are good ones and there are bad ones, but the good funeral will give you closure. And what that means is, all right, we're here, and we're kind of passing the torch. This is the end of it. Now the door is closed. I'm ready to move on with my life. I have closure. What a good funeral will do will give you closure. I have said goodbye to my loved one, and now I'm ready to proceed without them. This is what a good funeral will do. And what I do in the funeral is I talk a little bit about the grief, not a lot, but I emphasize that you can heal from grief. And what you have to do to heal is to allow yourself to experience the painful things that you don't want to experience. If you keep pushing it away, it's like any other problem. If you don't want to solve it and you keep pushing it away and pushing it away and pushing it away, you don't solve anything. And it will just raise its head to haunt you. If you can allow yourself to go through the experiences that are painful, it's a one and done thing. Once it's done, it's done. Then you can get closure and you can move on. It's not like you're ever going to forget the person that you lost, and that's not the purpose of a funeral anyway. It's to get the closure that you need so you can move on with your life without that person. And I tell people, how do you know when you're healing from grief? Well, you know you're healing because suddenly your mode changes. You're not constantly thinking about the person that you lost. You start thinking about other things, other relationships. You start thinking about going out with a cup of coffee with your friend. Your focus is not just on the person that you've lost. Your focus is on other things, and you're starting to get back to a normal life again. And when you can see that the loved one is no longer the 100% of focus that you have, then you know that the healing has begun, because now you're thinking of something else. You're thinking of the future. You're thinking of what you're going to do next. You're thinking about keeping your life on track, and that is a sure sign that the healing has begun. So I tell people that. Don't feel guilty if you have to think a lot about your loved one. That's a part of the grief. But also, don't feel guilty if you don't want to think about them all the time. That's a part of the healing. And if you can kind of keep those two straight, then you will be, it will help you a whole lot. The social withdrawal does not last. All of these symptoms that I'm talking about don't last too long, but they are terrible and they are intense while they're lasting. The difference between grief and depression, they're not the same thing. Depression is a different quality about it. Grief has a different quality about it, and the grief is very intense, and it's very fearful and frightening, and it's hard to function with it, and you have all kinds of symptoms, and you're really deeply grief-stricken. You can't seem to move on. But that abides, that just fades away, and then as a result of that, you'll start thinking in a different kind of way. You'll start thinking about normal life again, and the loved one won't be 100% the center of your attention. And when that starts to ease off, you have already started the healing process. One of the last funerals I did was for a doctor that I knew 20 years ago. I knew him 20 years ago. He retired. He moved to Florida. I didn't see him after that. I was a patient. But we talked a lot about things, and he knew I was a minister. And he came back, and he told his family he wanted me to do his funeral. So without having seen him for 20 years, I did his funeral. But I also incorporated this little section on how do you know when you're healing from grief. And this is the way that you can tell. You start thinking about other things. You're willing to think about other things. And the person that you lost is not the person that you're thinking about all the time anymore. Well, this is the first funeral that I left where everybody was smiling. And somebody came up to me and said, "You told us everything we needed not to know, and you didn't leave anything out." And so therefore, the funeral does have its purpose. It's important to have funerals. Some people don't, but the grief can languish and languish and languish. If you don't get the closure that you need, you can go into a complicated grief pattern, and that can last you for years and years and years. Better to do it, get it over with, feel better, move on with your life, and establish your healthy life once again. That is the purpose of what a funeral should do, and I think that some funerals do it well, but I think some funerals do not. But closure is the issue here. Now, I'm going to close it here. What I'm going to start next time is I'm going to talk about the symptoms of getting into a complicated grief, which is different than a normal grief. A normal grief is intense, but you move through it. A complicated grief, you stay in it. It is hard to move through it and hard to get rid of it. And as a result of that, it can affect you in your psychological health, in your physical health. It can affect you in terms of your lifestyle, and it can last for a long time, much, much too long. So I'm going to close it here. And once again, we do have the suicide hotline, 1-800-273-8255, and the domestic violence hotline in New Hampshire, 1-866-664-3574. I'm going to keep these up throughout all of the classes that I do on grief, bereavement, and suicidology, which will be coming up next, because grief, bereavement, and especially suicidology and drug use has increased so much that I want to include them, and we'll go from one to the other to the other. So we'll close it here. Please join me next time.